It's my pleasure to welcome you all this afternoon, this evening in Germany, for this very important event for us. It's really a pleasure for us to having Professor Christian Rieck today with us. And we are all very curious and interested in this discussion. And I would like to start saying thank you also to Arthur for organizing this session, for inviting Professor Christian, and I'm sure that this will be very interesting and important for our discussions in the Monnet chair here at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. So I would like to ask Arthur for make a short presentation of Professor Christian, and then we will have the presentation, the lecture, and in the end we'll have a session of questions and answers. And I asked Professor Christian if for the session of questions and answers we could also interact also in Spanish, since he's also native Spanish speaker. So this can be also an opportunity for the discussion could be more welcoming for all of us. Okay, so thank you so much, Arthur, for this short presentation. And again, thank you, Professor Christian. In the end, we will turn again for the discussion. Arthur, the floor is yours.
So hello to everyone. As Professor Alexandre said, my name is Arthur, and I'm also an international economic relations student here at UFMG. And today we're happy to have Professor Christian as our guest speaker to discuss with us this topic. So just a quick brief about Christian. So Professor Christian is an associate professor for development and defense at the chair of war studies at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And he's also the academic coordinator for the programs in war studies at the same institution. And for those reasons, he has a research focus on German foreign relations and European defense. So we're happy to have him. And thank you once again, Professor, for accepting our invitation. And thank you all for joining us today here as well for this conference. And having said that, Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Muito obrigado pela invitação. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm always eager to get to know students from around the world. As Arthur very well knows, he was one of my students at a summer university at Humboldt University in Berlin. So it's a great pleasure to meet you all. Let me share my screen so that you can see the presentation.
Is it working? Yes. Okay.
Yes, it should work. Yeah. Do you see the slide? That's great. So my topic today is, and how long should I speak? That's maybe the first question.
Well, half an hour, 40 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, it's because I can add, of course, information. So I'd say let's move the additional information into the Q&A. All right. So please ask questions. I'm fine with Spanish, and I can try to understand Portuñol and Portuguese. We'll try, right? So don't be shy. I totally understand that the European Union is a strange beast, right? It works in particular and mysterious ways. So that might be something that you have a lot of questions on. But German defense policy, and especially what I hear called Zeitenwende, which translates literally as sea change or turning point or watershed moment, is a big fundamental shift, right? But maybe you don't appreciate the shift if you feel like you don't see where the difference lies to what was German's foreign policy or defense policy before, right? Then also please ask this question and I can try to make this clearer. So Zeitenwende, and I put here a question mark. That's because since February 2022, so that's the Russian aggression against Ukraine, many things have changed in the German defense posture. It's really a big fundamental paradigm shift, right? And in a nutshell, it's a shift from what we used to call in the literature Zivilmacht or civilian power, right? It's a very specific foreign policy posture based on the idea that responsible states should try, or say enlightened states should try to civilize international relations, right? So not to transform economic power into military power like other great powers do, say the United States or France or Great Britain, okay? So Germany has taken this decision after 1949 to transform some of its economic power into other foreign policy instruments, like development policy, right? Germany, it's not a coincidence that Germany is one of the largest donors, bilateral donors and also multilateral donors in development cooperation, say, right? So this is a clear example, maybe the clearest example of German civilian power, right? So that was the foreign policy posture before. And this has been strengthened after reunification, after 1990, right? So this is really sort of the German paradigm. And now the Russian aggression in Ukraine has made the German strategic position more fragile, right? So Germany feels more threatened than before. And it feels more threatened than since 1990, all right? So we're not in a Cold War mood yet, if you look at defense policy, but we're getting there, right? So that's what I call the paradigm shift, okay? So we're relearning lessons from the Cold War, okay? And this is what we call Zeitenwende, or sea change or turning point. Okay, so that's the idea. And it's a term that was introduced by the Chancellor, I think 3 days after the invasion of Ukraine, right? And that's interesting for you to know. There was, it happens more in presidential systems like yours, but in prime ministerial systems like ours in Western Europe, was a really strange speech that he gave, because he came up with this idea of Zeitenwende, and he promised 100 billion special fund for the armed forces, right? And this happened without coordination with his coalition partners. All right, so it was a decision that he took, he and his staff took during a night 2 days after the invasion. All right, so he said something needs to change, and then he decided to get ahead of the political debate, right, and held this speech. But his coalition partners were surprised. They were as surprised as everyone else in the audience, because it is a big fundamental shift, all right, in the posture. And then, of course, this begs the question, well, 2 years on, we're now in the third year of the war, how much has really changed? There was a lot of hope that many things would change faster, right? A lot has changed, but not everything has changed, and not everything has changed enough, okay? So that's, of course, in a nutshell, my argument. So we'll talk about the security implications for Germany and for the European Union of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it'll have, this talk has three elements. So I'll talk a little bit about the sorry state of the German armed forces, the Bundeswehr, and it's all relative, right? It's still a powerful army, right? It has powerful equipment. So I'm not saying that Germany is not able to defend itself, right? But 30 years after reunification, we've been surrounded by friends, as we like to say. So strategically, the position didn't require the German armed forces to be sort of in the same state, right? In the same state of preparedness than in the Cold War, right? That's obvious, right? But if you do this for 30 years, then you'll see that at the end of that process, the armed forces are just not ready, right? So the levels of readiness and preparedness were really low before the war. And then since 2014, that's the annexation of Crimea. And then especially after 2017, so when we saw this whole sort of Russia-Ukraine thing heating up, the government has started to invest, right, in the armed forces and in the preparedness. But this was not enough, right? Not at all. So, and nobody really expected Russia to invade Ukraine. right? So we thought that signaling to Russia through sort of investment in the armed forces that we could deter Russia from attacking Ukraine. But of course, that didn't happen, right? Also, another lesson that Germany had to learn is that this deeply held belief in the German government, and that includes all governments of the past 20 years, so the conservative and the left-leaning governments, the social democratic governments, there was this deeply held belief that interdependence, so economic interdependence between Germany and Russia, and also between Germany and China, by the way, would more or less automatically lead to, say, a more rational foreign policy behavior of Russia, right? That we could prevent Russian imperialism, and we could liberalize Russia and make Russia more democratic simply by investing in interdependence, right? So in trade, basically, right? An investment between these two countries. And this obviously, right, didn't hold, right? That's a hypothesis that we have to unlearn. I'm not saying that it doesn't work at all, right? Because interdependence still raises the cost of conflict, right? But of course, it only works if the rationality of both actors is the same, right? So, but if you have, of course, sort of, if you have sort of in the Kremlin an actor that doesn't share this rationality because he's willing to incur a higher cost for his country because Ukraine is so important for the Kremlin, right? Then, of course, this interdependence hypothesis doesn't work anymore, right? We can't control what the Kremlin does, not through economic means alone. Right? So this means 30 years after reunification, the Bundeswehr is in a sorry state. I'll give you a few slides and some more information in a minute. Then we'll talk about what needs to be done, right? So, and I've written a paper 1.5 years ago with a colleague of mine where we thought about where the capability gaps were of the Bundeswehr, right? So which are the areas we need to invest in the most? And then I'll give you a political rundown of what the political parties say, right? Because we will not get the armed forces that we need, right, to become sort of a truly, say, powerful state able to deter Russia in the future, right? So we need to change tack, and money is only part of that equation. And then I'll switch to Europe, right? Because a question I get asked a lot abroad is, well, you know, doesn't matter, right? So nations should invest more into the armed forces, but of course they're never alone, right? They're in NATO, but also there's the EU. The EU can help out, right? And we can, why not do more burden sharing on the EU level, right? And could we then deter Russia sort of together as a group? And that is very difficult to do. And that is really due to the nature of the EU and EU decision making, right? So we'll talk about that in the last section. Then of course you're invited to ask further questions. All right. So Germany and German history, okay? This is a very specific, it's a German specificity, right? Something that's really sort of difficult to understand if you're not from Germany and Japan. These are the only two countries that we call civilian powers in the literature. And this is because both countries have lost the World War, right? And both countries have tried really hard to learn the lessons of liberal democracy, right? So the history of liberal democratization in our country, say Japan and Germany, is very different from the one, say, in your country, right? And so liberal democracy in both countries, but I'm talking about Germany now. In both countries, liberal democracy has this function of opening a door to the civilized world, basically. Right, so to help these countries return into the fold of the family of civilized nations, and this explains why the governments of different political colors have all invested in liberal democracy, because they had to convince the Allied powers, which were occupying powers, of course, in Germany, that they would be sort of ready, right, for democracy, and they would get sovereignty back, right? But this was a trust relation, okay? So you would have to convince the Allied powers that you're ready, and then the Allied powers would sort of grant you, some sovereignty. And this is why Germany in 1949, when it is created after 4 years after the war, doesn't have military, it doesn't have armed forces at all. Right? It's forbidden from having armed forces. It's also forbidden from sort of having military technology, owning military technology, investing in military innovation and science, right? All of this is impossible in 49. And the Adenauer administration, that's the first chancellor of West Germany. So Germany is also divided, right, into two countries. So the first chancellor of West Germany, he invests heavily, sort of a lot of political capital into convincing the Allies that his country would be sort of willing to take on a stronger defense role in NATO. Right? So NATO was created in 1949, but Germany is not a member of it in the beginning. And the Warsaw Pact is created a bit later, right? And of course, in the East, they said it was a reaction to NATO. But the Adenauer administration understood that becoming part of this defense and deterrence ecosystem that NATO was creating, right, as a frontline state, this would be a big lever to convince the Allies to grant West Germany more sovereignty. That's in a nutshell the idea or the story of the 1950s, together with economic reconstruction, right? So there was a lot of other things going on, of course, but even in that, money was scarce, but still there was a political decision taken to invest in the military very heavily. And the result is that in 1955, Germany is allowed to rearm. And it gets armed forces that were quite big for the time, 500,000 men under arms, 10 divisions. And it became a volunteer army. And this leads NATO to call the Bundeswehr in the 1980s the most effective volunteer army in the world. Right? So this is sort of this is just 10 years after the end of the Second World War, right? 10 years after the Holocaust, 10 years after National Socialism, NATO, or say the Allied powers, especially America, allows Germany to rearm and become an ally, right? Instead of an occupied country, right? And a former foe. It becomes an ally and a friend. That's the story of the 1950s. 500,000 men in a society that was not that big, 60 million, right? So it was a relatively high degree of militarization, only 10 years after the war. So it was very controversial. And then, of course, this is the Cold War posture, right? So the Bundeswehr is powerful, right? West Germany is a frontline state. It's ready to defend the country, right? And we always said that half of the armed forces were ready to fight within 48 hours, right? So it had a very high level of preparedness, and of course, due to technological advances, also a very high level of sort of military equipment, right? So it was a very powerful army, but it had this one design specificity. It's not a flaw. It was a conscious political decision, and I call this the structural striction. Right? You see this here on the slide. This means the Bundeswehr, and that's a lesson from the history, from the German history, the Bundeswehr should never be able to wage war alone. Never again. Okay, and this is why it didn't have a general staff, right? It didn't have command and control. So all of that was delegated to NATO, to SHAPE, right? So SHAPE is the military commander, always an American, and the military commander in Europe. So, and no other country, right? Look at France, look at the UK. No other country sort of embedded their armed forces to such a degree into NATO than Germany did. Right? That's again, it's a very specificity, right? A country like Brazil would never, right, sort of give up that kind of sovereignty over its armed forces, right? But that's again, it's a lesson from the history, and things are possible under special circumstances, right? So what we call at the end of the Second World War, we call this Zusammenbruch, right? It's a German term that explains not just military defeat, but also a big societal transformation, right? It means sort of the end of a project, the end of a worldview, right? It's a very, very powerful term. And this is the term that we use for 1945 to explain why Germany could then reconstruct itself in such a different fashion. Right? This becomes possible because of, you can call this a turning point also, right? Of 1945, right? And this leads to this very specific Bundeswehr. So the Bundeswehr of the Bonn Republic, that's the old West German Republic before reunification, did not have the ability for autonomous command and control. That's very important to remember. Then, even after reunification, and that happens in 1990, and what we call normalization of foreign policy, normalization means that the Bundeswehr after 1990 was able to deploy abroad, say on the Balkans, right? We didn't go into Iraq, right? But we went into the Balkans to stabilize Bosnia and then Kosovo, and also to bomb Serbia in 1999. This is called normalization, right? Is that Germany was sort of very special during the Cold War, no foreign deployments, right? So it was really just all focused on territorial defense. And then in the 1990s, we get this new mandate called stabilization, right? We still do this, but in the 1990s, it was a big change. And this is called normalization. That's because especially left-leaning actors in academia, but also in the media and in civil society, were afraid that Germany now would become normal again. And this means militarized, maybe fascist, maybe bad, right? So that Germany could maybe become sort of a threat for European neighbors again, right? And unlearn the lessons of the Cold War. There was, in the 1990s, was a fear, right? I think politically it was out of the question. It was just getting back sovereignty, right? And then sort of helping out European allies, say in the Balkans, right? So I think this is the basic idea. But of course we had to, so the politics had to convince society, right? And there was societal pushback. This is why this is called normalization. So after reunification and normalization of foreign policy, the Bundeswehr remains unable to project power independently of the alliance. Right. So in 1994, Germany gets command and control back over the Bundeswehr. Only so after reunification, and the command and control center for stabilization missions abroad is here in Potsdam. But still, the Bundeswehr doesn't have a general staff as it had in the 1940s, right? Or even during the First World War, right? So this is still sort of politically impossible. And I call this the structural restriction. And then, of course, you need to sort of, you can say, well, you know, isn't part of the structural restriction the low levels of readiness, right? That we say we disinvested into the, from the armed forces, right? So it's the low levels of readiness. We also reduced the number of soldiers from 500,000 to 280,000, sorry, 180,000 now. So we call this the peace dividend, right? So isn't that sort of a normal, a rational reply to a change in context factors, right? So now Europe is peaceful, Germany is reunified, Europe is reunified, right? In 2006, all the Central Eastern European countries become members of the EU. They've become members of NATO before that, right? So we're now surrounded by allies. So of course we don't need the same level of defense spending, right? So you could say, well, isn't this a historical lesson as well? Right, and if you look at these iron crosses, right, this is the German cross, and then we like to say, well, you know, there's this historical connection, right? So there's another specificity. There's a strong sort of, I think, misunderstanding of how the military works in Germany, and this is because of the history, right? So whenever people see the iron cross on the right, and this is the iron cross, the iteration that the Bundeswehr uses today, and they've changed these colors in the 1990 to be less martial, okay, then they see the iron cross in the middle, okay, so the one on the left, so you have the Bundeswehr on the right, then you have the one on the left. This is the Wehrmacht iron cross, right? So the Bundeswehr used the same symbol than the Wehrmacht used, and the Wehrmacht is the German armed forces during the Second World War, so the Nazi war machine, if you want to call it that way. Then you have the Reichswehr, this is the German armed forces in the First World War, right? And for those of you who know, the German armed forces took over the day-to-day government of Germany in 1916 during the war. The war effort consumed so many resources that the OHL, which would be the general staff, the general command and control center of the German armed forces during the First World War, takes over day-to-day government. It becomes a military dictatorship for 2 years. Right? And this would be associated with this iron cross, right? And then you have, of course, on the left, the oldest iron iteration of the iron cross. This would be the iron cross of the Teutonic Knights in the Middle Ages, right? And of course, the Teutonic Knights, this was a military order founded to Christianize the Baltics, right? So it has a very bloody history too. It's a very sort of strong military history. And you can, in some, especially on the left of the political spectrum, still paint this picture, right? This is where the fear comes from, right? They see a connection of militarism, right? Militarism runs through the German history since the Middle Ages. This is the kind of story that they write, right? It's a narrative. And then, of course, this explains why then the society in large part would be critical of armed forces. And that's really schizophrenic, because during the Cold War, the armed forces protected the country, right? And helped deter the Warsaw Pact from invading Germany, right? But you see, it's a complicated relationship. I know it's complicated in your country too, but I think it's very different. The complication is different, right, than in our country. So, but I would say this historical narrative, of course, is utterly wrong, right? You can't compare the Bundeswehr of today, which is which has a civilian oversight, which is deeply democratic, right? It has never been as well educated and as well controlled also as today, right? The Bundeswehr today is a democratic army, right? So this is a story that we keep sort of repeating, right? To sort of overcome this deep-seated mistrust, right? Of military power. Why is this important? This is important because now, of course, we're in a different situation, right? We need to invest in the preparedness of the armed forces again, right? And for that, we need to overcome the mistrust and the criticism that's still in the civil society, it's still present there. So look at this, this graph. It shows two things. In blue, you'll see the defense budget. And of course, if you look at defense budgets and you don't take into account inflation, then it always looks like this, right? Even in your country, it looks like there's always more money for defense. But of course, this is bonkers, right? This is wrong because you have to look at inflation and at the purchasing power, right? What can you actually buy with that kind of money? So, but this is still is interesting. You see that there's a rise, right, in the defense budget until 1988, 1989. Right, so that's reunification, and then it goes down, and this is the famous peace dividend. Right, so that's the money that Germany saved, right, by underinvesting, right, in the preparedness of its armed forces, right, for obvious and probably also for good reasons. And then it goes down or stabilizes, right, until 2006, right, and that's the invasion of Crimea. Well, no, that's before the invasion of Crimea, but this is when we see Putin changing the foreign policy posture of Russia. Okay, so in 2008 we have a war in Russia wages a war in Ukraine, in Georgia. I'm sorry, the August War. So that is seen by some as a signal, right, that we should prepare more. But we see here sort of an uptick. All right, so that's sort of that's the paradigm shift. Okay, so it starts in, is it 2006 or 2005 or so, right? And then it goes up, it creeps up, right? And reaches then 43.9 billion euros, right? In 2021, that's before the war. It now stands at roughly 50 billion, right? And then on top comes this special fund of 100 billion that we're supposed to spend over the next few years to buy ammunition and also new military equipment. Right, but you see, 100 billion means it's 2 full years of defense, right? But it only buys you 2 full years, right? So now we're talking about either a new special fund or a replenished special fund, right? And this is an extra constitutional means, okay? So the Constitution doesn't foresee a special fund like this, right? So there's a big political debate whether this is legal at all. And then look at the other graph. The right line, the red line is the proportion of the defense budget compared to the overall budget, the overall government budget, right? And this is what I mean, okay? You see that the proportion is going down, right? So in the 50s, in the 60s, you see heavy investment in the military, right? So 27, and then it goes up to, it's almost, is it 30% or so of the defense, of the budget, of the government budget goes into defense. This is a huge commitment, right? And then it goes down, and this is because the economy grows so fast. And then, of course, you can sort of keep spending more, right? But the proportion goes down. And this is what happened. That's the story of the rest of the Cold War. And this is why people sort of forget about the Bundeswehr, right? Because if you look at the proportion, you always spend less every year, right? But of course, in absolute numbers, you still spend more. And this keeps readiness and effectiveness high, right? But of course, as long as the economy grows, right, it doesn't hurt so much, right? You don't get this bread and butter problem. And then look at what happens here in 1990, right? That's the peace dividend again, okay? So you see a sharp drop in the proportion of the defense budget, right, compared to the overall budget. And this is where we still are, okay? So roughly 10%. It's now going up, but it's not going up fast enough. What does this lead to, right? This leads to low levels of readiness. This is a really dramatic graph. This is the readiness levels of the main weapon systems of the Bundeswehr in 2017. So that's before the war, 2017. It's the low point of German readiness After that, I mean, this was written, this is an official paper written by Bundeswehrverband. It's by the Union of Soldiers. Okay, in Germany, the soldiers have their own union, and they've written this because they say it's impossible to work under these conditions. We need to sort of tell the public how bad the situation really is. And then look at this. Look at the weapon systems. Eurofighter, Tornadoes. This is fighter jets. Okay, so out of 128 Eurofighters, only 39 were ready to fly in 2017. And the Tornadoes have now been decommissioned. So now we're buying F-35, so American gear. Out of 93, there were only 26 ready. Right? And this is dramatic because this is our Air Force, right? The Tornadoes were important, or were and still are important as for nuclear deterrence, right? So Germany doesn't have nuclear weapons of its own, but it shares nuclear weapons with the United States. Okay, so there's American nuclear weapons stationed in Germany. It's called nuclear sharing. They're still under American control, but it's German aircraft that would take these nuclear weapons and sort of bring them into theater. All right, so it will be German soldiers sort of putting their lives on the line to use American nuclear weapons, right? So that's a way for Germany not to have nuclear weapons of their own, something that was, of course, impossible after the war, right? But so this is our strategic deterrence, right? Only a third, right, of all planes would be able to fly in 2017. Right, so that's sort of the problem. You see how big the problem really is. Transport aircraft, so 3 out of 15, and these are A400M. So these are great. These are wonderful new systems, but maybe there's too much technology involved, and they never really sort of got off the ground. So we're still having problems with the A400. Then helicopters. You see the numbers here. Tiger is the most modern helicopter. Also probably there's too much technology in the literature. We call this over technology. So you have new weapon systems, then they can do a lot of things, a lot of wonderful things, but yeah, maybe the technology makes it too difficult for them to deploy to, say, very cold climates or very hot climates, right? So you have less resilience. So that's a bit of a problem, but it also means that they need more maintenance, and this usually means that readiness levels are lower. Right? And then you have the Leopard. So this is the German tank. And this is, again, dramatic. Look at the numbers. 105 out of 244. Your country has more tanks than Germany has today. But Germany had 6,000 tanks in the 1980s. Right? You see the level of disinvestment, right? And then frigates, 5 out of 13. The new frigates are wonderful, but again, they're very difficult to maintain. And then 1 out of 6 U-boats. And all these U-boats were new. The submarines were new. There were no submarine was older than 2 or 3 years. Right? You see the problems that we're having with procurement, okay, and maintenance. So this is, of course, dramatic. It's a big problem. It led to more investment into readiness, so the numbers have improved then dramatically, right? But this is the starting point, right? And you have to understand Zeitenwende, the turning point, the political defense turning point, right? By understanding the baseline, right, where this change sort of started, from which this change started. So this means that we have really unlearned to do proper war, right? So conventional high-intensity war, as in Ukraine, right? So this is my argument. We're not prepared to wage a war as in Ukraine. So we're learning a lot of lessons now. And this is because for the past 30 years, we've invested into more mobile, less heavily armored units, right? So the Bundeswehr since the 1990s has become a nimble, a more flexible force, right? Able to deploy all over the world, so that's new, but of course only able to fight an asymmetric war, right? Against less capable actors, right? Say terrorists in Afghanistan, that's the typical case, or terrorists in Mali, say. But for that, of course, you can't use a Leopard to fight terrorists, so counterinsurgency you can only do with Boxer and other sort of more nimble and faster units. So this has taken at least 20 years to retool, right, the Bundeswehr to become a stabilization force that you can deploy abroad, right? But it has come at the price of unlearning these more traditional lessons, right, of high-intensity warfare. Today, we're not able to do this. We always like to say that even if the readiness levels were higher, and of course they're not high enough yet, we would be able to fight for 3 days, and then we run out of ammunition. Right? And this is dramatic, right, for one of the central powers of the NATO alliance. And France and Great Britain have similar problems. So it's not just Germany, but it's especially, the problem is especially deep in Germany, right? And of course, the front has moved, right? The eastern flank now, NATO's eastern flank doesn't run through Germany. It runs now very close to Poland. All right. So this means, of course, Poland feels much more exposed. And this explains why Poland has cranked up the defense budget from 1.5 or maybe 2% to 3% of GDP. This is a powerful change. So this means that Poland has invested heavily now in all weapon systems and has more tanks, more active tanks now than Germany. This is a big change, right? So it's Poland that could invade Germany now, right? So Poland should not be afraid of German tanks anymore, right? Poland is right now is the more powerful army because of its geographic position, right? So that's also understandable. So, and these are the lessons that we're trying to relearn now, right? So focus again, retool the Bundeswehr again to relearn the lessons of territorial defense instead of focusing on stabilization so much. Even though, and that's ironic and problematic, even though the demand for stabilization missions around the world will only increase with, say, climate change. Right? Climate change will lead to more competition over resources, like water. It will lead to more state fragility around the world. And this will mean that the demand for stabilization will remain high. But the defense budget, the German defense budget, can only do one of the two things. It can either do territorial defense or it can do stabilization. Right now, we're not able to do both with that kind of money. But the demands are going up on both sides. Puts a lot of stress on the armed forces. This is how the German society likes to see German soldiers, right? As blue helmets sent across the world to do good. Right? Especially, we call this the Bundeswehr as a development actor. This is the only way to convince, well, until 2022, to convince the German society or German civil society, the German voters, right, to invest more in defense. Because only if we can tell them that story, right, that we have a military actor, not for territorial defense, because that's sort of something that we did in the past and war is really bad, but sort of we can use a military actor to do good. Right? And this reminds me of the 1976 argument that Alfred Stepan has made for Brazil and other countries in Latin America, right? Is that, armed forces are violent actors, right? They have a specific tradecraft and culture, and we need to take these actors seriously by giving them something to do. If we don't do that, then they might become a threat to democratic stability, right, in our countries. And then, of course, in the 1990s, in all Latin American countries, and Argentina is another example, then the new mandate after the dictatorships, after the return to democracy, is to give them sort of missions abroad, right, as stabilization actors. Right? So in Germany, the motivation is different, but still normalization means stabilization abroad, right? Doing good, right? Protecting development, making development possible, right? And in some cases in Afghanistan, the German armed forces actually built schools, right? And drew wells, right? So that's something that's really sort of, it's strange, but it's the result of the political calculus and the societal understanding or misunderstanding of the armed forces, right? So, of course, armed forces should not do development, right? They should do territorial defense. This is what they're trained for. So what needs to be done? I already said that so there's two mandates, actually there's three, right? So there's stabilization and territorial defense, and I explained there's a tension between the two because the defense budget is not big enough to do all of them, both of them. But of course there's a third one now. So if you remember the Indo-Pacific strategy and this whole debate that we had in 2022 before the war broke out, is that Europe should have a stronger role, a larger role, a deeper footprint in Asia. And I always ask, like, what the hell are we doing in Asia, right? So we have other priorities right now. I said that even before the war, right? And that's because the preparedness levels were so low. So I would call this global power projection or military diplomacy. So, right? So we were on our way to create a third mandate, right? Sending more ships to be present in the Indo-Pacific, right? So sending ships to Singapore, also sending airplane to Singapore. This is not because because Europe would be able to defend Southeast Asia, say, from Chinese aggression. Of course, that's impossible. Only the Americans can do that. But it was to reassure partners in Southeast Asia that Europe would not forget about them, right? And that would be in an alliance with the United States and would do some burden sharing, right? Basically, we would deal more with Europe, invest more in defense at home, right? And this would leave the Americans free to sort of counter Russia in this sort of longer term geopolitical struggle. But this is global power projection. Yeah, it's an extension of the argument that I've just made. The defense budget is not big enough, right, to do all three. So I call them irreconcilable priorities, not just competing priorities. So what kind of Bundeswehr do we need? So what kind of armed forces do we need? Modern high-intensity warfare is protracted. It's something that we're seeing in Ukraine. Nobody thought that there would be this little mobility in the war, right? Because, I mean, both countries are heavily industrialized, also almost on a par. If you look at some of the weapon systems, say tanks, at least in the beginning, it looked like they were very similar. And everybody expected this to be a rerun of the German Blitzkrieg, right? So high mobility warfare, so heavy armor, sort of massive, right? Massive heavy armor, so a lot of them, but quickly, right? So sort of have more movement on the battlefield. And this hasn't happened at all, right? We see a stronger footprint of drones, and drones are cheap, right? Armor is expensive, and armor has not been able to sort of keep the promises that that armor usually makes, right? So sort of being fast, right? And able to sort of capture Kiev in a week or so. So modern high-intensity warfare is protracted. This means for Germany, the army needs more and better heavy armor and artillery. So we have good systems, but we need much more, right? The attrition rates in Ukraine are tremendous, right? It's really sort of difficult to picture how many personnel, right, and materiel is lost every day, and also what kind of ammunition you need, right? So Russia spends 3,000 to 5,000 artillery cartridges every day. That's something we can't do. We can't do this. So if you look at our stocks, right, we can do this for 3 days, and that's it. So the army needs more and better heavy armor and artillery, including guiding munitions for precision fire to increase endurance and perseverance. Complement that with ubiquitous drone reconnaissance and drone attack, right? So politically, it's very difficult in Germany to give the Bundeswehr drones that are loitering munitions, right? So drones that you sort of deploy in theater and then they just sort of wait, right? And then they find a target and then they attack autonomously, right? That's something that Germany still hasn't gotten around to. And the French and the British are a bit further ahead. And of course, Ukraine now is learning all of these lessons for us. But drones is sort of the big topic there, right? Our drones are way too expensive because we use the drones for other things, for long range reconnaissance, right? So the Eurodrone costs 750 million euros, but the drones that Ukraine uses costs like 50 euros or so, right? So they're a very different kind of drone. This means that we have a gap, right? The Navy is well prepared, we say, to achieve sea superiority in the Baltic Sea. This has improved now the situation because of Sweden and Finland, right? Both countries have now joined NATO. That's a big change because both countries used to be neutrals during the Cold War. So now sea superiority in the Baltic Sea is all but assured. And this is good for the Baltics because the Baltic states are small and very difficult to defend. So this has improved their geopolitical the military situation, say. So of course the Bundeswehr doesn't do this alone. Together with NATO allies, this is assured. As long as maintenance for surface and below surface vehicles is guaranteed, right? So maintenance is always a problem. The Air Force is going in the right direction to achieve air superiority and air defense with acquisition of F-35 and Arrow 3. Arrow 3 is an air defense system built by the Israelis. And so it's very effective, and we see this in Israel, sadly, every day. But that's the kind of system that we're now buying, and it's really strange. Imagine this: the Bundeswehr didn't have air defense systems. It did have a capable air defense system, but it was deployed in theater. It would usually go into a stabilization mission, or we would send these systems to Turkey, right? And whenever there was sort of fear that, say, Syria or Iraq would attack Turkey, then we would send them out, but we don't have that many systems. So the Bundeswehr is not able to protect German cities from air attack. We just don't have the necessary systems, right? So arrow 3 now will fill this gap. You see the kind of sort of vulnerabilities, right, that we still have. And then the Bundeswehr, last point, should improve planning and aid to increase resilience of military civilian infrastructures in the Baltic states, especially in Lithuania. And this is a point I keep making because I talk to people from the Baltics a lot. Also, this triggers this episode, another episode. Germany is now sending 5,000 men. That's almost a full brigade, a full heavy armor, so tanks, Leopards, to Lithuania. That's another part of this Zeitenwende sea change moment. This has never happened before. So that Germany would station troops in a state, that Lithuania, that has a complicated history with Germany, was invaded twice by Germany in the First and the Second World War, but the Lithuanians invited Germany, they still pressure Germany to this day to increase its footprint to help it defend Lithuanian soil and people, right, from a possible Russian aggression. The Baltics are really afraid. And Germany has now reacted in sending 5,000 men. This is really, I can't overstate this. This is really strange, right, and very new. And I've visited the Bundeswehr detachment there. It's right now, it's 1,200 men strong. It's now going to be reinforced. It used to be a NATO tripwire force, but it's now becoming a full German brigade. And this means that Lithuania right now is defended by German tanks, right? So right now there's only 12 tanks, Leopards in Lithuania, and this will go up to 30, 40 tanks, right? But this means, and Lithuania is now buying German tanks, but this means that the German detachment will be roughly 1/3 or 1/4 of the Lithuanian troops. Okay, so you see how small Lithuania is. Right? So yeah, so for Lithuania, this is a big change, and for Germany, it's a big investment. So let's see where this goes. So it's now more than a tripwire force. The levels of readiness are high. They train every day. They train like they would go to war tomorrow. It's really scary to see. I don't see a war happening anytime soon. But of course, to be able to deter, right, a possible Russian aggression if the war in Ukraine goes well, then of course you need that kind of training, right, and that kind of readiness. So Zeitenwende, okay, so you see we had this lot of these gaps. The chief German, the supreme German soldier, the supreme German commander, he said, we call him the general inspector. He said famously, a few weeks after the war broke out in Ukraine, he said, basically, we're naked. Militarily, we're naked. He was almost fired because he said that. So you see the kind of level of frustration in the armed forces. Yeah, and so Ukraine has changed a lot. I don't do all of this is in German because it's from one of our papers. The argument I'm trying to make here is that still some weapon systems are sensitive for Germany, right? And the example would be loitering munitions, right? So heavily sort of attack drones. But of course, we can use drones for reconnaissance. And we need to learn the lesson that reconnaissance doesn't happen sort of somewhere sort of in the air, right, from managed by a central command operator. But what we need is more smaller drones. So when every sort of artillery regiment and every tank regiment, they should have their own drones. Okay, we should decentralize that kind of power to get sort of more real-time and more ubiquitous drone reconnaissance, right? So this is what's one of the political discussions that we're having right now. It's going in the right direction. And then maintenance is getting better. Readiness levels are going up. Yeah, I said arrow 3. Okay, so air defense is getting better, right? So we're filling most of these gaps, but 100 billion euros is not enough to do this. Right? It's not enough. We said once, even in 2022, we said, well, to bring up the munition stocks, to fill up the stocks, right, for a 30-day war, not a 2-year war, this would take 30 billion out of the 100 billion. And then we had 6% inflation, right? So inflation is also sort of eating up some of the money. So you see, this has to become a long-term project. And the defense minister, and in the beginning of the war, we had a defense minister that had to be fired because she was totally incompetent. Now the new defense minister is sort of speaking the right language, and he's preparing the government and the society to spend more. So he wants now either another fund or more money, right? So 2% of GDP as promised to NATO, or even more, right? And I see at least probably 3 to 3.5%. If we really want to do everything well, we need a lot more money for a long time. And that's difficult to sell to a society that is anti-militaristic. So what kind of Bundeswehr will we get, right? I'd say the political sensibilities, of course, are still there, right? And they will come back in force once the Ukraine war settles into a less hot phase, because this will happen someday, right? And in order for them, so that the government will not sort of start to go back into a slumber, but to keep investing in defense. Now we see think tanks and also the Bundeswehr itself is now sort of writing analyses and publishing analyses that give the Bundeswehr 5 to 7 years to rearm itself, to prepare for a possible war with Russia. That's the kind of language that we're using right now. Even though the war is not very likely, but of course it's only unlikely if deterrence works, right? So that's the political game. Invest now to deter better, but for that we need to prepare for war. And that's, again, in a post-heroic, anti-militaristic society, it's a very difficult lesson to learn or relearn. And then the Sondervermögen, so that's the 100 billion special fund, is only a first step. Okay, I'll run through this quickly because I'm running out of time. What about Europe? Okay. What about Europe? And then the first question you need to ask, well, why do we think about the EU if there's already a European institution that does defense really well? And that's NATO. And we call this in the literature, there's a certain isomorphism. That means that the EU is mimicking, is copying some command and control institutions, right? But also in procurement and in planning. So the EU has a capability now that has a military dimension that looks similar to what NATO does, but is much smaller. That's an isomorphism. It's always a problem in international organizations, but why should you have two that do the same thing, right? Duplication is expensive. But the idea here is that Europe the division of labor is NATO does the high intensity warfare, right? So preparing the eastern flank for an assault, whilst the EU can focus then more on stabilization. So I think this is the division of labor where it's going. Yeah, I mean, it's controversial, right? And the EU, some say the EU shouldn't have a military dimension at all. But since 2017, and then again, that's before the war, but after the annexation of Crimea, the EU has really started to sort of change tack. And this is interesting because the EU has neutral members in it, right? Austria is a neutral member. It's now the only neutral member left, right? All the other neutrals have now joined NATO. But that's really interesting that a neutral country would then sort of accept, right, a military dimension in the EU. All right, so remember this. I think there's a good chance we'll get a functioning division of labor between the EU and NATO. But the EU since, and I think this is 2006. Let me look. Yeah, since 2007, the EU has EU battle groups. That's something it's one of the sort of least kept secrets of the EU, right? So we have battle groups, and basically this is of course not an EU armed force, and this is national capabilities that are sort of given to the EU for a while, right? Still under national command, but there's sort of a framework, and then these national capabilities sort of become part of a battle group, but it's basically a multinational force. And we have several of these battle groups, and we've had them since 2007, but Europe has never deployed them, never, ever, right? And of course, these were designed for longer term stabilization missions, even though in theory, they should be able to sort of wage a longer term high intensity war. Yeah, but of course, when in 2007 everybody thought about stabilization missions abroad. Yeah, so it was a good start, but this is an instrument that was never used, right? And this explains, in a nutshell, why the EU will never become a military actor that is effective. Right? The literature says the EU is not a unified foreign policy actor, but if it's not that, then it will never become a unified military actor as well. Or either. That's impossible. And this is due to different strategic cultures, of course, say the French or the Germans, because they have very different understandings of how a war should be waged, and of course, they have very different national interests, right? So the Germans are in Mali because the French basically forced them to join them, right? So that France would have to do this alone. So Germany doesn't have pronounced national interests, say, in West Africa. But the French do, of course, right? So that's sort of different interests, different strategic cultures, a willingness to wage war, a willingness to wage higher intensity war, right? A willingness to incur cost, right? So the French, when the French go, they go all in, right? So you'll have more casualties in the French battalion than in the German battalion abroad, because the Germans are more sort of restricted. So, and all of these elements, right, basically mean that you will never get sort of a common EU way of doing war, a way of war, right? A strategic culture or so. That's really impossible. Otherwise, we would have used the battle groups, I think, more. But in 2017, that's almost my last slide. In 2017, the EU passed or introduced what I call the comprehensive defense package. And it includes these three elements: the European Defense Fund, which was already in existence before, but was then replenished, and is now, the EDF can now invest in companies, right? So in the technological base, it's called, of EU member states, to help them sort of develop weapon systems, but also develop the production capabilities, say, for munitions, right? Things like that. And now, since the war in Ukraine, the EDF can also buy munitions and weapons and send them into a war zone to Ukraine. That's another big change. Right? So the EDF was strengthened, even though it was there before. Then there's CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense. This is interesting because it's the first time where member states, they open up their books, the military books, to the neighbors, right? And there's a structured review, right, on readiness, on, say, availability of munitions, and I don't know, and a few other things, and also probably gaps, military gaps. And this is coordinated and structured, right? And it happens for every country. So there's every year, so that you do a new set of countries. And this is supposed to bring about more transparency, more accountability, but also more cooperation between member states. So that's interesting. It didn't happen before, because why? Because it's an infringement on national sovereignty. Right? So because you trade military secrets now more than you did in the past. And the last one is the permanent structured cooperation. Was very ambitious in the beginning, so it's working, but of course it doesn't work fast enough. This is over 20 different cooperation projects between EU member states, including the UK, even after it left the EU, because the UK for European defense is important, of course. And the idea here is that this permanent structured cooperation can improve also the technological base, but also the availability of military equipment, say, right? And also research and development in Europe, right? So the EU now has a mandate to help out financially, yeah, through distributive means to improve European readiness and defense. And this has happened in 2017. It's a new role for the EU, right? It didn't usually dabble in defense before. But, last slide, a true European Defence Union that would include EU-owned capabilities, it will not come about, right? Not even the long term. I don't see this happening in the absence of like a cataclysmic war or so, right? But if you look at present trends, that's really, really unlikely, probably impossible. It remains inconceivable that the sovereignty of member states over their military assets will be qualified to a significant degree, that they will give up sovereignty over their national capabilities. France will never do this, right? The Bundeswehr might, right? Because Germany is more used to sharing sovereignty in the military realm. And this would dramatically change the character of the EU as a union of states, right? Less civilian power, more military power. That's a debate that we need to have, because I think let's protect the civilian power of the EU and delegate, right, the military stuff to NATO. It's much more effective, and we have the Americans in, and as a backstop. So European defense will continue to be a messy affair, mixing supranational, intergovernmental, and national elements, and the EU's role will remain that of an enabler, enhancer, coordinator, facilitator, right? So it's basically money and coordination, and maybe central, maybe planning, yeah, but not more than that. We can't expect more of the EU. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Professor Christian. It was a really enlightening presentation, and I'm sure that we will have many questions. I have some, but I will give the chance for Artur to start. So Arthur, please.
Yeah, thank you also, Christian, for the presentation. I actually have two questions, but I'll do only one for now. So if other students would like to ask their questions as well. You mentioned the Zeitenwende approach, and you also the theory of Germany being considered a post-Cold War civilian power. So my question is, considering that maybe these two approaches cannot be in coexistence, in order for the Zeitenwende to be fully implemented, does Germany need to let go of its post-Cold War civilian power, at least when it comes to its foreign policy?
Yes, thank you, Arthur. That's a good question, of course, right? It's a great question. I don't see these two approaches not being able to coexist, right? So they're not incompatible in my understanding. I understand that civilian power is understood by different actors in a different way, right? So the more pacifist the actor is, the more they sort of underappreciate a military power in that equation, right? But of course, Germany is not a neutral country, right? Germany is not Costa Rica that can give up its armed forces, and this doesn't work. Germany is also not a big Switzerland, and Switzerland has armed forces, right? So I would say an enlightened and also a pragmatic understanding of civilian power would include both a strong military element focused on territorial defense, right? Because every country should be able to defend itself from aggression, but also then a strong, say, development posture, right? So a strong role, continuing the German role in development policy. And I think, and right now, we haven't taken that decision. So the development budget is still sort of rising, right, to 0.7% of GDP, and the defense budget now will probably hover at 2% of GDP. So this will not change right now. Of course, if the economy doesn't, I mean, Germany is not in an economic recession right now, but it's not growing very strongly. And the German, as I showed you on the first slide, the German political system, due to its coalitionary nature, is not very used to defining priorities for the budget. Usually we grow out of a problem, right? So we want to spend more, but the economy is growing, so there's more money every year to spend. And so if you have sort of the problem, where do you put the money, the bread and butter problem, right? So social policy or military defense, that this is not a problem in Germany, because as long as the economy grows, you have money for both. Right, so that was the Cold War magic of the German economic miracle, and of course, right now we're not seeing that same kind of luxury, right? So I would say the German system needs to learn this lesson, the political system, to define priorities. And then I can answer your question, right? Because if the priority is to spend more in defense, put more money into defense, and then reduce the investment in development, then you could make this argument that maybe civilian power is now sort of renegotiated or changed, right? And maybe it becomes incompatible the longer this goes on. But right now I see both on an equal footing, and I would say this is a good thing, right? Because I still see sort of this German posture, the civilian power posture, as being exemplary, right? There's something other countries can learn from.
Maybe I think that I can ask a question, and then I saw that we have a question on the chat, but anyway, let me start with my question. It's more about the EU. Of course, I know that your main interest is Germany, but I would like to hear you about your impressions about the future of the conflict in Ukraine, in the light of the change this year in the European Union because of the elections in the parliament. So do you think that especially the pressure for the right-wing parties and eventually an increase in the participation of these parties in the parliament will change a bit the scene? I'm not talking only about the European Parliament, but also the national elections in different countries the European Union, and I think that this is also eventually a question for Germany. On the other side, on the future of this plan that you show us about the future investments and etc. So the equation changes a bit with the political interest involved. So I would like just to hear you more about this next steps. Thank you.
Yeah, let me take this question first, and then I'll take Professor Patricia. Of course, this is a big question. It's a very good question, of course. I would say two things. The elections in Europe will, the upcoming elections, so that's going to be in a month or so, they will not change the political landscape too much. Let me venture that hypothesis. And this is because the von der Leyen Commission has sort of been very successful. In the beginning, I thought, and von der Leyen is the Commission president, for those of you who don't know, and she has called the Commission a geopolitical commission. This was quite new and very ambitious. And she did that before the war broke out, right? But it shows me today that I was wrong, because I thought it's a problem if you call yourself a geopolitical commission. This will create a lot of expectations. But the question is, can an EU Commission really deliver on these promises? Right? Can the Commission make the EU more geopolitical? The answer is no, right? We know this because the institutional structure in the EU is not like this, right? So you have a strong parliament, but of course, a much stronger council, right? So it's the member states that call the shots, especially in defense, but without defense, how can you become a geopolitical actor, right? So I thought it was not a smart move in the beginning to try to do this. I saw a big gap between expectations and capabilities. But then the war broke out, and von der Leyen has really gained stature, right? And she's really seen today as a very successful Commission president. I think this is really exciting. Yeah. So I would say this will help the established parties. But you're absolutely right. We've never had a higher proportion of anti-systemic votes, right? And MEPs, so members of parliament in the EU Parliament. And this number will grow probably. Yeah, so it now is something between a quarter and a third, right, of all MEPs are anti-systemic, either on the hard left or on the hard right. And the problem is that both are more pro-Russian than the established parties. So I see your argument, but given the power structure in the EU, the action happens in the Council when it comes to these geopolitical questions. And I don't see that many member states really leaving this or sort of canceling this EU consensus on Ukraine. The longer the war goes on, the more likely this will become. I totally understand, but that's sort of more medium term than 2024. Right? So I don't see this happening right away. But you're right, there's a French election coming up, right? The Economist has just published a paper, should we prepare for a Le Pen presidency? And I think, yes, we have to prepare. Even if it doesn't happen now, it will happen next time. Yeah? So the established parties in France are under siege. And in Germany, we have state elections in 3 states in former East Germany, and those states have the highest proportion of anti-systemic voters, so right-wing populists mostly. This is scary, right? But it will, in the German case, it will not change the German national consensus, not yet. Right? The question is, if this goes on, what does this mean for the national government? But right now, this will not change the consensus. Also, even though Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, is under a lot of pressure and under much fire because he doesn't communicate well and doesn't communicate enough, but he's not preparing, right, the German society for what's coming. So that's, of course, a big criticism, and I think it's valid. But helping Ukraine for him is a deeply felt, is a heart issue, an emotional issue. So I even think he will fight for Ukraine against his own political party. This is my hunch. Yeah, some say, because, I mean, for those of you who don't know, right now what happened a week ago in the German parliament is that his party, the Social Democratic Party, his chief whip has basically criticized the chancellor. He said, we need to stop aiding Ukraine. We need to think about freezing the conflict in Ukraine and then thinking about how to solve it, how to pacify it. Right? And of course, you can't do this in the middle of a shooting war, right? And the chancellor is sort of selling the story that we need to do more. So that's the big problem. I don't think this guy is going to be fired, but I also don't believe what some of the media are now saying is that this was a good cop, bad cop situation, right? That the chancellor would sort of just continue to push for helping Ukraine more, aiding Ukraine more, and then you would sort of try to test this new hypothesis, right? Should we renegotiate our stance vis-a-vis Ukraine? Should we invest more in, I don't know, in ending this conflict? Yeah, but I don't think this is the case. I think for the chancellor, it is a much more emotional thing. And you can make similar cases, at least for the big countries. Take Poland, take the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is now, right, it's investing in this ammunition initiative to sort of basically send everything they have to Ukraine. Yeah, all Czech tanks have now been lost in Ukraine. The Czech Republic doesn't have a single tank left. Right? So some countries are really all in. And this gives me, it's a very emotional thing. So a very emotional decision. So I think at the end of the day, it will not change. Not now, but maybe in 5 years, right? So we will not be able to sort of keep up that kind of attention and help for another 5 years. That's also true. And this is why Putin is in it for the long game, right? He just sits out, he waits. As long as he can keep incurring that kind of cost, right? And then of course we have an election in the US. That might become a game changer. Yeah, I agree. But not in Europe, I promise.
Okay. So, Patricia?
Thank you, Professor Christian, for your wonderful presentation. My question is also regarding the European Union. You have well explained the turning point of Germany's foreign and security policies after Russian invasion in Ukraine in 2022. There are also many analysts saying that there is a geopolitical awakening of the European Union, especially after this year, 2020, this invasion, the last invasion. My question is regarding the nexus, France and Germany. They support not a similar position regarding this geopolitical Europe. We are in another more unstable order. And well, how do you think that this nexus is so fundamental to a turning point in this, or to this geopolitical awakening in the next future?
Yeah, it's another great question. And you're probably alluding to the problems that Macron and Scholz have. Those two guys don't like each other. They're just too, they're just too different. Yeah. But I mean, compare this to the situation in Latin America. Andres Malamud famously talks of presidential diplomacy. Right? He says, and I think this is a fascinating hypothesis. He says, regional integration and the defense integration in Europe would be such a case, right? So regional integration only works, or only happens in Latin America if the presidents either have personal rapport or are from the same political party, also same political tendency, right? So if you have sort of a lot of social democratic or left-leaning presidents, then you'll have integration. If you have a lot of conservatives, then you'll have integration. But if you have a mixed bag, then nothing will happen. And then take Europe. So, I mean, I think there's probably there's not that many examples of sort of a functioning of French-German amity, right? De Gaulle and Adenauer, they liked each other, but they weren't personal friends in the 1950s and 60s. So when the German-French treaty is signed in 62, both, of course, have a deep respect for each other, right? And I think they become friends over time. But Charles de Gaulle is a war hero. Right? So a very different man, also much more conservative probably than, at least when it comes to national defense, than Adenauer. And then Willy Brandt and his counterpart in France, they didn't get along. Schmidt and his counterpart didn't get along very well. Then Kohl and Mitterrand, they were, I mean, there's lots of nice pictures, but Mitterrand hated Kohl, right? Mitterrand didn't trust the Germans in '89 to do for the reunification. Mitterrand didn't want reunification in Germany. Right? So you can find these many episodes where even though the president's, the chancellor and the president didn't have a personal rapport and they weren't from the same political party or same political leaning, that you still have integration. Right? And I mean, I've just written a book on West German foreign policy during the Cold War, and of course, it has a chapter on France. And you could see in the sources that there's an understanding in both governments that the Germans are so strange, and the French, we don't understand them. Right? So these are very different cultures, also political cultures. But there's always cooperation and there's always integration. And everybody, you see the ministers, it doesn't have to be the chancellor and the president, but I see the ministers saying that, can we look for more projects to do together? Can we sort of integrate more, even though maybe on the high political level, there's friction? Right? Let's keep this relationship going. And this is a shared experience. It grows out of the war, but it carries until the 1990s. I think this is really interesting, right? Even if, especially if you compare it to other world regions. So, and this is where I come from. So against this backdrop, I'd say what's now happening between Macron and Scholz doesn't really matter at all. Right, so we'll still have deep integration, and the amity is real, right? So I mean, this is we call this Schicksalsgemeinschaft. France and Germany are in a community of fate. This is really a lesson, I think, and politically, it's like a holy cow, right? You can't criticize the German-French alliance; it's impossible. So what we have to do now, and that's the today. We need to invest more into the Weimar Triangle, right? So we need to, in the 1990s, there was this new idea, we should complement the German-French axis, which was very strong in the EU. And everybody said the EU integrates only if France and Germany agree. That's probably correct. Today, it's a bit more complicated, but in the Cold War, it was like that. And then attach Poland to it, right? Complement it by bringing Poland into the equation. And this is when we're trying this now with Donald Tusk. But of course, the national populists in Poland are not dead. But with the liberal Donald Tusk, right now, we could try a restart. And I think this is really important. It will make this relationship more complicated, right? Maybe not even more effective, but symbolically, this is so important. Okay, so that's symbolism, all right? Symbolism is not policy, I understand, but it's important. On the other side, I'd say France can play a role militarily for defense, right? Because France can complement German efforts very well, right? Germany is the logistics hub for the Americans in Europe, right? But Germany doesn't have a lot of offensive capabilities of its own. France has them. France also has a strategic deterrent. It has nuclear weapons, right? So I think, and this is the next book I'm going to write, so I think we should retool European defense and rethink the Franco-German alliance on the military basis, right? So why not integrate the nuclear weapons into the German defense planning, right? So do something like a nuclear sharing agreement with France, not just with the Americans, right? So to try to start integrate European military forces on the national level, because you have to start somewhere. And Germany has a lot of experience, right? It has integration with the Netherlands, it has defense integration with Poland, with the Czech Republic, it's now sending troops to Lithuania. This will also lead to defense integration, right? So there's already a lot of experience. The problem is that from a purely military effectiveness perspective, this is not always a good thing, but I would still say that's something that you need to think about. Right? And then there will always be this problem that national sovereignty rules, right? It rules supreme. Countries, member states will not give up their military units, right? They want to retain sovereign command over those armed forces, right? So this is a problem. But this is why NATO has over decades, right, has tried to integrate these strategic cultures into a larger framework. So European defense will run through NATO for the foreseeable future. Yeah. And independent of the quality of the Franco-German alliance. That's my point. Yeah, have I answered your question?
So do we have another question? We have some questions on chat. First, Luis Henrique asked about, I don't know if Luis Henrique would like to speak, but anyway, he asked something about the Brazilian foreign policy, your impressions, if Brazil should have one position or another in this more belligerent environment. Anyway, it's much better when students ask themselves the question, but anyway, the chat is also a help.
It's also easier to write in English than to speak in English, probably. So
Yeah.
No, it's fine.
Excuse me.
Read the question.
Can you listen?
Oh yes, please, Luis Henrique.
I'm in a kind of a lousy environment, so if you do not listen correctly, okay. I will just read my question. I asked, so first, Professor, thank you for your presentation. It was very enlightening. I don't know if you will be able to answer my question, because it's more about Brazilian policy and how Brazil should prepare itself. But anyways, so based on the understanding that the world is going through a major geopolitical shift towards a more belligerent environment, how do you think that Brazil and the Brazilian national security forces should position itself? Because based on the history of Brazilian foreign policy, we usually get a more neutral positions overall in geopolitical conflicts between the West and the other bloc. But how does this neutral position should translate itself into national security? Because today Brazil is kind of dependent on the American nuclear umbrella, for example, and in other Western dependencies for defense. But we are not automatically aligned to the West. So should we have our own means of defending or of preventing Brazil from being attacked? Or should we align with one of the sides in this new belligerent geopolitical environment? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Well, I wouldn't call the Brazilian posture neutral, right? It's one of non-alignment or of selective non-alignment. That's probably fairer. And I would say this is a rational, and I keep telling this to German saying this to politicians in Germany and also to academics who don't understand Latin America very well. Active. And I call this active non-alignment, right? It's not like being on the sidelines and not having an opinion, right? And always being non-aligned. It really depends on the issue, right? It depends on the history of the relationship. So this is why you have changing alliances also, right? So it's active non-alignment. But of course, this is a rational foreign policy choice in an environment that is becoming more fluid, right? It was an irrational foreign policy choice during the Cold War, right? But now I think changing alliances it's a reality. We need to accept it. But the argument I'm making is that it's a rational choice, right? Because you have more options now. Why should you automatically align with one side or the other? And I would say there's still strong reflexes, so say Western reflexes, especially in the larger powers, say the BRICS and others. There's still reflexes, and my argument is that, say, if push comes to shove, say in a hot war scenario, it's unlikely, right? But in a hot war scenario, then the defense establishment and also the governments would still more or less automatically align with the United States, right? If the US is not an aggressive state, right? But it's so I think there's still these reflexes are still alive, right? For obvious reasons, right? Because if you align with the strongest, more effective actor, if you're on the same side in that issue. What we've learned in Ukraine is, and I thought this was a mistake. The German chancellor started traveling around the world and tried to convince non-aligned actors in the world, in the global south, to become part of this, to pronounce themselves on this conflict. But of course, the hope was that more of these countries would actively align with, not with the US, but with Europe, because obviously Russia was an aggressor state here. This hasn't happened at all, right? This has backfired tremendously, and the German foreign minister was close to tears because she didn't understand how the world could not condemn the Russian aggression. But of course, this means that there's a fundamental misunderstanding of the national interest in the global south. The more powerful a country is, and Brazil is not Uruguay, right? It's a powerful country in the global south with strong national interests. A foreign policy of non-alignment has a lot of benefits, right? So this is why you can be in the BRICS, right? But still, so in theory, be critical of how the war is waged in Ukraine, right? So you can do both, right? You can still be a friend of the United States, but also a friend to Russia, and this is because There's many options. Economically, this is a smart choice, right? I'm not saying that Russia is a big investor in Brazil, right? But of course, Brazil is in the BRICS because it wants to have preferential market access to China, right? So this also, and Oliver Stünkel from Getúlio Vargas, he makes the same case. He says, basically, the BRICS is an entry point, right, for some states to have a special relationship and market access to China. So this is smart, right? It's economically rational. So this is something we need to understand. The war in Ukraine is a Western problem. I would say it's a Western European problem, but we're happy that the Americans are helping out because otherwise we couldn't. And so we need to sort of focus on that. That's our priority. So we shouldn't expect others to become part of the struggle because, and that's also important, the more fluid this international environment becomes, the more non-alignment is important to keep the level of polarization in the world low. That's a theoretical argument, right? You need buffer states that sort of stand on the sideline, don't become sort of an automatic player in every sort of Western initiative, right? Because the levels of polarization remain low, because then these countries, next time, they don't have to automatically align, right? So standing on the sidelines, sort of being non-aligned, it really sort of takes some pressure out of that system, because otherwise the geopolitical competition between the West and China and the West and Russia will just blow up really quickly. Right? So I see it's not just a smart, economically smart and politically expedient, but it's also, I would say, necessary for the stability of the international system. That's something that German policymakers don't understand. But it's, I think, it comes from this theoretical argument. I think we should sort of frame it in that way. So what does this mean for Brazil? It means that non-alignment, you have to be sort of smart about non-alignment. Yeah. So look for economic advantages, because I mean that's smart, right? I mean China has an interesting market, right? China is a big investor, right? I'm not saying that this automatically leads to alignment with China. That would be wrong, right? So the problem that Western policymakers with Lula have, or with the present Lula government has, is that they were so hopeful that this would be a replay of Lula 1, right, of the first Lula government. But if we look at climate change, if we look at sort of economic development, fossil fuels, all of these things, the protecting the Amazon, we see there's a change, right? So the new Lula government is more nationalist, in inverted commas, less enlightened or liberal in the Western sense. Right, but of course, the Lula government is a result of a coalition, right? A domestic political situation and context. So there's a lot of, I would say, disappointment right now. But again, I think it stems from a misunderstanding of the situation in Brazil. Does that answer your question?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you, Christian.
So again, thank you.
I see another question in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, it's a question from Rodrigo. Eventually, Rodrigo would like to read his question too about democracy. Do you like Rodrigo?
Okay, I can read. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Professor Christian, thank you for your presentation. And the question goes, you talk about making Russia more democratic. Merkel stayed in power for more than 16 years, and I haven't seen anyone calling Germany an autocracy. Putin is on his 12th year now, Xi Jinping is on his 11th. Also, Yanis Varoufakis showed how the Troika controls the finance of the Eurozone and doesn't finance control everything today. And nobody in Troika have been elected. So the questions. First question, would you say that USA, having only 2 political parties funded by the same finance industrial military complex, is a real democracy? And second, don't you think the Europeans should be more worried about their own and their allies' democracy or lack thereof? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think my premises are a bit different, so I'm not as sort of critical of the quality of democracy, but I'll explain in a minute. But my main argument is, yes, of course, the Western ambition, right, to be, to lead the world, to lead the United Nations is a big problem. It is also outdated. right? It comes from the Cold War, and then, of course, winning, in inverted commas, winning the Cold War in the 1990s, right, as the unilateral decade or the unipolar moment. This is where it comes from, right? But this is a big problem. The West doesn't have a lot of credit in the rest of the world. And this is because you can always find contradictions in foreign policy. That's obviously the case, right? Every country has the contradictory foreign policy. I would still say at the end of the day, Western initiatives, say in the UN, or even Western intervention, not US intervention, but Western intervention, like take the Balkans or we'll stay blue helmet operations or so, right? Even the Afghanistan debacle, right? The idea democracy to the world. I understand that it doesn't flow from the barrel of a gun. That's absolutely correct. It's the wrong means to use, right? But the impulse, I think, is not as bad or as cynical, right, as you can make it to be. And but of course, the West has lost credit in the rest of the world also because the quality of its own democratic systems is deteriorating. That's another contradiction. And I think, and Atul knows this because this is an argument that I keep making in my course at Humboldt University on global governance. I think the West can only claim leadership in this rules-based liberal international world order if it gets its act together at home. So looking at the US, I see a lot of problems with the quality of democracy. One problem is the two-party system, as you rightly say. The two-party system tends towards dysfunction, towards gridlock. That's a big problem. You can do this for a couple of years, but you can't do this for decades, right? And I think it's a shame, right? When we look at the haggling to get the government funded and refunded every year, right? I think this is unworthy of a liberal democracy that sees itself, right, as a democracy promoter in the rest of the world, right? So I always say, and also the Trump phenomenon, it's not just Trump, it's a phenomenon, right? He's the result of a particular political situation, right? It's the Republican Party, right, veering to the right, becoming isolationist and nationalist and protectionist, right? So if it's not Trump, it's going to be someone else. Right? And I think this is a big problem because the US looks more and more like what Juan Linz, right, would call a dysfunctional presidential democracy, right? It looks more Latin American by the day. And it would be funny if it were Uruguay, right? But it's the United States, so it's not funny at all. And I think we should point a finger to the US and sort of try to help them get their act together. I totally agree. And then you don't even have to talk about the Capitol riots, right? Trump is a phenomenon in and out of itself is already a problem, right? If you look at the quality of democracy. So that's the one thing. So I'm super critical there. If I look at the German system, I would say, yes, we need constitutional term limits. I think this would be a very good idea. But not because I have problems with the quality of democracy, because Angela Merkel was voted in power for four times, and she would have been voted in again if she would have decided to run again. That's really because she embodied this German political culture, right? Don't take any big decisions, right? All the action happens beneath the rug, right? Don't sort of rock the boat too much, and embody stability. And then you can become a 16-year chancellor. Helmut Kohl did the same thing in the 1980s and 90s. So that's, again, it's a result of a particular political culture and political situation. I have lots of problems with the foreign policy decisions of the late Merkel era. I agree. And this leads me to this argument that we need constitutional limits because if you have a political project, a political coalition, if you look at the German history, after 8 years, it's exhausted, right? They don't have any fresh ideas. People are really sort of fed up. They're not fed up enough to change the government, but it's like it's run out of steam. So why not then sort of have a mandate, sort of a term limit of 8 years, right? So you can be sort of voted in again if it goes well. If it doesn't go well, of course you're not. And then you have to change, right? You have to change the face. Then remember, this is a parliamentary system in Germany, right? So, and I think this is great because having term limits would mean you would need to change the chancellor, but you can still sort of vote for the same political party. You don't have to wait until you're fed up with the government so much that you vote for another party. You can still say, well, I'm a conservative, or I'm a green, or I'm a liberal, so I'm still going to vote for the same party, but it's going to be a new guy with fresh ideas and fresh projects. So it's a great way to combine, in theory, combine change and continuity, which would be super compatible to the German national character, I would say. Right? But of course, this is something that the presidential system cannot copy, right? Because you vote for a president and then you vote for Congress. It's two different votes. And in Germany, you have an automatic majority. The chancellor or the prime minister always has a majority in parliament. If it loses the majority, you need fresh elections, right? And in presidential systems, of course, that's not the case, right? It leads to gridlock. It leads to a power struggle between the president and Congress. And this, I think, leads to polarization. And polarization leads to, I'd say, less stability in foreign policy, but also in domestic policies. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Professor, thank you.
So thank you, Rodrigo. Arthur is also again with his hand raised. So Arthur, please.
Yes, Professor Christian, just if we have time for one last question, we'll go back to the conflict in Ukraine. And I would like to ask, in your perspective, how do you see the emerging European security order with this conflict? Because, for example, considering a post-Cold War security order in Europe, especially with three institutions, NATO, EU, and the OSCE, how do you see this new order emerging? So considering these three institutions.
Yeah, thank you. To make a long story short, I'd say the OSCE is on its way out. There was hope in the 1990s that this could become sort of a pan-European security organization, right? We talked of security from Lisbon to Vladivostok. There was a big hope, but the institution wasn't able to deliver on that. I mean, structurally, of course, the membership base was inclusive, right? All the post-Soviet states, including Russia and the former Soviet Union, Soviet republics, and then, of course, all Western European states. So it was a very inclusive, it still is a very inclusive membership, but we could see from the very beginning that there's not that much political consensus, right? So it was an organization that was never really, really effective. In the 1990s, of course, became important. What became important was democracy promotion, human rights. So I understand that, but it would never have led to, I would say, hard security. It would lead to cooperation, to a negotiation, maybe, right? So it's a great channel where you can talk behind closed doors without talking bilaterally, right? It would have been sort of a group discussion. But of course, that's something that Russia under Putin doesn't want, right? So if we see the foreign policy posture, right, and we see a hardening of the foreign policy posture in Russia, right? It's not like Putin came into office being like this, but he became a more nationalist, I would say also more expansionist / imperialist actor. But what I'm trying to say is that today's Russia is interested in talking bilaterally with the other great powers, especially the US, but also Germany. So they're interested in a bilateral relationship to cut out the other members, right? So it wants to talk to Germany, say, take Nord Stream, right, the gas pipeline. And of course, there's an example of a bilateral project. And the idea was to cut out all the Central European states, right? So that Russia could pressure them, continue to pressure them, right? But still sort of keep the economic benefits, right, of integration with Germany. And so and this, of course, doesn't sit well with the idea of the OSCE, right, where every country has one vote, right, one vote, one state. So I never saw the OSCE as being sort of that, as having that much potential, right? But of course, it has a mandate, and a few things work really well. Observing votes, observing what do you call this, elections, right? So there's something where the OSCE works quite well. They can send observer missions, even blue helmets. So they have the OSCE can also send some military observers. So things like that. I think that's useful, right? But it only works if all the members share a common idea, right? And the common idea used to be liberal democracy in the 90s, but what is it now? Right? So it's a gridlocked organization. And this leaves the other two, the EU and NATO. And as I said before, there's a lot of isomorphism. So I see the EU copying, some of the NATO elements and becoming more of a hard defense actor, but without the command and control capabilities. right? And that's the division of labor. So territorial defense will be delegated to NATO. As long as the US doesn't leave it, then we probably have a completely new discussion, but I don't see this happening. And then, of course, stabilization missions, power projection abroad, this is something that can be delegated to the EU more and more. But military capabilities, right? So the tanks and the planes and the helicopters, this will remain under the purview of member states, reducing effectiveness. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Gabriel, well, I think that we can have a last question. So Gabriel, please. We don't like to abuse of the patience of Professor.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, we can have a last round of questions.
It's late in Germany. No. So Gabriel, please, you're mute. Gabriel, the audio is not working. Can you try again?
Yeah, write your question in the chat.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
I can take another question while Gabriel writes his question into the chat.
Yes, okay.
So if there's another question.
Do you have another question? So,
can I make another one?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, not a polemical one, but yeah.
Well, I don't know. John Mersheimer, I don't know. Do you know him?
Yeah, sure.
Realist. Okay. He wrote in 2014 that the USA and its European allies share most of the responsibility for the Ukraine crisis. That's after Russia annexed Crimea. Due to NATO and European Union eastward expansion and West's backing of the pro-democracy movement in Ukraine since 2004. Do you agree with his position? If so, would you say his view still applies? And if not, why?
Yeah, I disagree. I was really surprised at Mersheimer's position. He's also an outlier. So if you look at sort of the whole field of international relations specialists, also if you look at the field of the IR realists, he is an outlier. And I think he's factually wrong. I understand where he's coming from, right? He says, Russia has been signaling to the West that Ukraine is important. Ukraine is the crown jewel in the former Soviet Union, and don't mess with Ukraine, otherwise you'll have to bear the consequences. I mean, that signaling was clear. It was misunderstood by most policymakers in Western Europe. So I agree there. And then, of course, then Europe or the European countries did what they always did, right? I mean, since 1990, right? So they invested in democracy promotion, right? So they funded pro-democracy actors. And of course, more conservative, more statist or national interest-based systems, they don't have to be autocracies, they would see this as meddling, right? But more liberal, more open societies, as the CEE countries in the 1990s became, and as Ukraine is now becoming, they don't see this as meddling necessarily. They see this as an investment in the quality of their democracy, of their democratic actors. Right. So there's this, I mean, you can see the same phenomenon from different perspectives, and then it looks very different. I understand it can look as a Western intervention, in inverted commas, a democracy intervention with civilian means. And I can see the West sort of feeling encircled and threatened. Right? So we should have taken that more seriously. The Germans, of course, didn't see this because they said, well, we have this interdependent relationship, right? So, I mean, Russia, it doesn't make sense for Russia, right, to change this posture because economically it'll be so costly, right? So this is where I think where the German sort of misunderstanding comes from. They didn't see this. It wasn't in their mindset. But I also think that Mersheimer is factually wrong because the Ukraine, I mean, what's happening now since 2022 is an invasion of Ukraine, right? This is not struggling about the geopolitical position of Ukraine. This is not trying to make Ukraine a neutral state or a buffer state. It was France and Germany in 2008 that prevented a Ukrainian bid for NATO membership. It was France and Germany. They said, no, Ukraine is too sensitive. We don't want to anger the Russians. And since the 1990s, and that's an experience sort of from the reunification negotiations, the Germans have been very accommodating to Russian interests, right? Of course, they said we need to sort of give CEE countries, Central European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, right, Baltics, we should give them an opportunity to decide which side they want to be on. Right. So, but of course, the Western idea is that, well, we ask the societies, right, they should make an election and then decide whether they want to become part of the EU or NATO or become a neutral state or whatever, or become a friend of Russia. Right. Of course, all of these societies voted in large numbers, right, to join NATO because of the history, right? They were afraid of another Russian occupation. And you can make the same case for Ukraine, right? So I would say, but that's a controversial position. I would say, as Germans, right, we have a responsibility to protect the integrity of Eastern European, Central Eastern and Eastern European nations. Right? Because of our history, right? We try to destroy them once. So I think we have a responsibility to sort of allow them to choose. And it's fine if a country like Belarus says we want to go the Russian way, and it's unclear if the society really wants this, right? But I think you need to give them choice. That's my liberalism in foreign policy. Give them choice. And if you give choice to the Ukrainians, they would opt for Europe, right? Or for, say, NATO, and not the CSTO with Russia. So the liberalism where I come from. And then, of course, sort of from that liberalism flows the territorial guarantee. Take the Charter of Paris and the Budapest Memorandum in the 1990s to protect Ukrainian territorial integrity. And the guarantors of Ukrainian territorial integrity are countries like France, like the UK. This explains the UK, the forceful UK posture vis-a-vis Ukraine, which is helping a lot. Because it's a guarantor state, the US is another guarantor state, and Russia was a guarantor state. But now the guarantor state has invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine has trusted Russia so much that it has given up its own nuclear weapons. And that's because of the Budapest Memorandum. They said, all right, so we have a security guarantee now from both sides. This will stabilize our position. We'll give up the nuclear weapons. And now today, Ukraine, of course, has I would say they would be happy if they had a nuclear deterrent. Right? So, and I'd say, so you have to understand that too. This, it's not just, I mean, you can't sort of tell the story of Russian fear, right? So Russian encirclement or whatever, or Western incursion into the Soviet space and post-Soviet space. But you can also make this other story is that that we've tried to accommodate Russia a lot, right? And there was an open hand for Russia to become part of this club of liberal democracies, right? Taking it into the G8, help doing democracy promotion in Russia. Okay, so the hand was open, but then Russia, of course, changed tack, and that's because of a domestic political situation. The years were terrible. There was chaos, and it was Putin who brought back order. So I understand that too. And Putin was authentically liked by the Russians in the beginning, but we see that his levels of popularity have been going down a lot. And the last election, I think it's quite clear that this last election was stolen. I don't have a problem if if he wants to stay in power for another 20 years, that's totally fine. If the Russians elect him, then that's fine, right? There's nothing we can do about that and should say about that. But the last election, I think, was not a fair and free and fair election at all.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Gabriel sent us his question. I
guess it's working now.
You can read? Okay, yes, it's working. So please.
You guys can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was a pleasure. My question is, you talked about we being in a turning point where we are not yet in a Cold War scenario, but we are kind of getting there day after day. But like, it's understandable, the Germany reaction to the conflict, like investing on the defenses, the military defenses, and it's understandable. They are close, and it's a risky situation. It's a tense situation. But what in your opinion, it would be kind of right to do? Because like if everyone starts getting with the fear of a possible invasion and start investing on defenses and military things and a war possibility, it would make the situation even harder and harder, to the point where we are not in this turning point event and we are at a true Cold War scenario now. But it's also understandable to invest on military defenses, because you can just wait and hope everything ends well and nothing bad will happen to your country. So what, in your opinion, would be the best thing to do? Like invest on something in military defenses, or just hoping everything ends well? Because of course there exists the situation like Brazil, where you wait and see what would be better to do. But it can also happen to be in a point where you can do this. You can just wait and don't take sides. So what, in your opinion, would be the best thing to do, if exists the best thing to do? Thank you.
Yeah, that's the billion-dollar question, right? So what should we do now? Of course, non-alignment is not an option for Germany, and because of the geographic position, right? That's a luxury countries in the global south have, because they're so far away, far removed from that conflict. Right? And I would say this is totally fine, right? Whenever sort of Nigerians or Ghanaians tell me that, you know, there's a hypocrisy in the West doesn't care about the conflicts in Africa as much as the other conflicts, right? But now there's a conflict in Europe and now they want everyone to be on their side. I think they're totally right, right? I think a country cannot be interested and invested in every conflict all the time, everywhere. That's impossible to do. Not even the Americans can do it. Right? Or you can't do it well. So I would say, yeah, they're right. Of course, we're not interested in all the conflicts in the world. But if there's God forbid, another war between Paraguay and Bolivia, then the Europeans would not care, right? Because it's far away, right? But it would be a big issue, the biggest of issues for Brazil, for obvious reasons, right? Because of geographic proximity. So this is why I say there's a division of labor around the world, right? So right now, of course, this is a conflict that's close to our borders, of course, right? Kiev is just 2 hours on a plane from here, right? It's not far away at all. So of course it's going to be important for us and less important for the others. So we need to accept that, and you need to accept that we won't be interested in be able to meddle in all conflicts around the world. So that's my first point. So this is our job now, and we need to sort of make the best of it. And what is the best of it? So I would say invest in deterrence, to keep your own people safe. Right? And I told you, this is why I started with a slide that showed you the readiness levels. Right? If the armed forces are so skeletal, the readiness is so low, so we're so vulnerable, then we need to change that. Right? It is not an army that can deter a possible Russian aggression, even if it's unlikely. So invest in deterrence. And of course, you do this nationally, but also as part of a larger alliance, NATO. So that's step one. And this includes hardening the Baltic states, because they feel threatened the most. This explains Germany sending troops to Lithuania. It's part of a larger NATO change, right? A larger NATO investment. So harden the most exposed, the most vulnerable actors. And the Baltics are small, right? They cannot defend themselves against Russia, even a diminished Russia after the Ukraine war. That's part of step one. And step two is give Ukraine the ability for more resilience, right? So it means give Ukraine a fighting chance to survive as a nation or as an independent state. The question, of course, is, does this include carving up the state, like a German solution after the Second World War, right? I mean, this would be a cynical way of dealing with this, right? So maybe you can placate, right? You can appease Russia if you give it territory. The Ukrainians don't want this, I think, for good reason, because Russia has shown that it'll gobble up more territory, right? Not now, but maybe later. It will rearm and try again. So that's maybe politically not very expedient. But what I'm trying to get at, that step three, is we should think harder about possible solutions, right? So the Social Democrats here, of course, are not wrong, but the Social Democrats say we should stop arming Ukraine. But this means that Ukraine will lose. right? It will lose its territorial, not just its territorial integrity, but its sovereignty. It will become a satellite state of Russia, because that's the end game, right? It's not about the Donbass and Luhansk and the Crimea. It's about Ukraine as a whole. So harden Ukrainian defenses to improve its negotiating position in a negotiation to end the war, because wars always end through negotiation. They're never won on the battlefield. Right? You can only sort of improve your position vis-a-vis the other guy. But at the end of the day, there has to be a negotiation. I think Germany will have to play a huge role in reconstructing Ukraine, but hopefully also in helping bring about a solution. But it shouldn't be Germany alone, right? It should be part of a sort of a European concerted effort, because we need to reassure Ukrainians, right, that the security guarantees that we're giving it are stronger than last time. Well, last time around, it didn't work. This is why Ukraine wants to join NATO. I think Ukraine is going to join NATO, but maybe not now. So one element of trying to bring an end to this would be sort of keeping Ukraine out a little bit more, but finding a special relationship, right? So investing in a special relationship between NATO and Ukraine, so that Ukraine will not be sort of fully occupied by Russia in the future. So I think this is where it could go in the moment.
So, thank you so much, Professor Christian. I think that it was really fantastic for us to have this opportunity of discuss this topics with a real specialist, and sometimes I try to do my best in class to explain the conflict and to think about the future scenarios, but it's very complicated actually at this moment, and to hear it was very interesting for us, and we'll continue on these discussions in the coming weeks with the students and etc. So thank you so much again. I would like to invite you to come more and eventually in person for our events here. And for now, okay, please, we'll talk about this. But for now, I would like to let you with our herzlichen Dank for this fantastic conversation, and yes, thank you, Arthur, also for the invitation of Professor Christian. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Prazer. It was very nice meeting you all. Yeah, talk to me again. No problem. It's very easy to set up a Zoom meeting, right? So we can repeat this if you feel it's useful.
Okay. Thank you. So
yes, I'd like to thank you as well, Professor Christian and Professor Alexandre, for organizing this event. And it was a very interesting presentation with all the questions asked. So I think it was a good opportunity as well for us to understand more of your perspective on the European perspective on the current conflict.
Okay, so thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.